I think it's going to come up more and more, because I think the people that have been kept quiet are now going to feel more and more emboldened to say, oh, how was your weekend? Oh, actually, I went to the Reform Party conference. And it's going to be like, oh, okay, is that a microaggression? I mean, what are we doing here? Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about my visit to the Reform UK Party conference and what the main takeaways are for employers. I'm joined by two fan favourites who've both been on the podcast before. Heeral, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Tanya. Thanks for having me on. I'm Heeral Gudka. I am an EDI consultant that's been working in the space for the last 11 years. And Tanya kindly describes me as a sensible EDI consultant. So I'm just going to go with that.
Okay, great. And Levi?
Hi, Tanya. Good to see you again. I work mainly in the higher education sector as a trainer and consultant now, but in a very former life, I was also an EDI person.
Okay, great. I should just say I'm loving the on-screen diversity we've got going on today. We look like the Sugar Babes.
Well, we know that all the box ticking is the only thing that matters in EDI, right, Tanya?
As long as you don't expect us to sing, I think I'm happy.
Oh, come on, Levi. Okay, so let's talk about the Reform Conference. So it was on Friday the 5th and Saturday the 6th of September at the Birmingham NEC. I was there for both days. We haven't spoken since I got back. We did a prep call last week, but we actually haven't been through anything that's happened. And I know you're both absolutely dying to hear what it was like. So do you want to ask me about it? Levi, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I guess big question, why? Why did you go? Why Reform UK conference? Why now?
Do you mean because there probably weren't many other HR or DEI people there?
Well, I guess I'm interested in the sense that I think I'm right in saying you haven't been to other party conferences this year, or you're not planning to go to any. So why pick this one in particular?
Okay, well, my main reason is that I think anyone who's paying attention knows that the political temperature in the UK is rising pretty fast at the moment. And I'm keen to start conversations about how employers can prepare for what's on the horizon, because at the moment, I think many of them are pretty vulnerable. I think it's safe to say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the three of us share the view that in the past 5 to 10 years, a lot of UK employers have not done a great job of maintaining politically neutral workplaces. And that's crept into kind of culture, policies and practices. So despite having had Conservative prime ministers from 2010 to 2024, I think the kind of accepted cultural orthodoxy in most large organisations has been, I think you'd have to describe it as left-leaning, probably because HR teams tend to be left-leaning. They tend to be university graduates. They're often London-based. And I think what's happened is they've been allowed to push their politics onto their colleagues and even bake them into policies in places. Now, I think they would probably term all of this inclusion. But I think groups like gender critical women, Christians, Jewish people, Black conservatives, anyone who voted for Brexit would probably say that they've actually felt pretty excluded from this culture and even silenced and pushed out. So I guess the reason for going to this conference is I think Reform UK is unique in that it's becoming quite suddenly a serious political force with broad support and lots of momentum. And I think that means that the backlash against the existing workplace orthodoxy that we've all got so used to over the last few years is now here. I think the HR teams, and I think managers probably in general across businesses, are in danger of misjudging the mood of their own employees. So, for example, I've seen people on LinkedIn pontificating on what they're calling the far right protests, even though there were clearly lots of ordinary people, including lots of mums and grannies in pink T-shirts in the crowd. And they're also sort of rather sneering about the trend for flying patriotic flags around the country. There seems to be very little curiosity about what's really going on here. So I think organisations that they represent are actually quite exposed. Do you have any thoughts on that initially, either of you?
I think I tend to agree that reform is shaping the agenda politically. the momentum, as you say, is very much with them. So sensible for employers to try and get ahead of that curve if they can.
I agree with you, Levi. And I also think that, like Tanya said, employers aren't paying attention because what I can see is statements being made by company leaders, by HR directors, by HR managers and junior HR people that are very disparaging of anyone that might even consider being a Reform UK supporter. And the fact that there are so many people in the country who now say that, yes, I would vote for Reform UK if there was an election, means that those people work in those organizations. And the fact that employers seem to be completely oblivious of that when they're making those statements, I think is a worrying concern. They think everyone that works in their company or their organization thinks like them.
Yeah, I think there's a disconnect quite often between the people in the headquarters, which are often in London, as I say, often university graduates, and the broader workforces. But I mean, you just don't know who the person sitting next to you votes for. Some people are keeping very quiet at the moment. So there's a real sense that people don't really know who their colleagues are and where they are politically at the moment. The second reason I should just add is that, as you know, I do love a conference. And I have to say, as does my audience, rather unexpectedly, seems to enjoy my stories of going to various conferences. So check out the episodes I've done about the Stonewall Conference and the CIPD's Festival of Work, if you haven't already listened to those. They're both unexpectedly popular, with thanks to you two for being good guests on those. It's actually quite funny to think about those two conferences in relation to the Reform Conference. I mean, these are clearly very different events with very different crowds. I'm pretty sure I'm the only person on the planet to have been to a Reform Conference and a Stonewall Conference. But I thought it'd be quite fun to sort of compare and contrast. And there were some similarities, so we can get onto that a bit later. Actually, 1 minute before I move on, this would be a great moment to mention that I've been invited to speak at a conference myself in October. I know you guys know about this, but I like to show off. It's a free speech festival called the Battle of Ideas, which is in London on the weekend of the 18th and the 19th of October. I'll be recording a live episode of This Isn't Working. It's going to be great on the Sunday at lunchtime with the author Eric Kaufman. The title of the episode it looks really good written down, but it's really hard to say. It's Who Will Win the War on Woke Workplaces? Yeah, I did it. So I'll put the link in the show notes, which includes 20% off if you use the code WORKING. So that'll be really fun to do. Do come along to that. Right, back to the Reform Conference. Heeral, you had questions for me? I know you wanted all the flavour and the colour. You're dying to ask me, aren't you? I can tell by your face.
I want to know, what was it like? You know, who was there when you were looking around the room? What sort of faces did you see? What were your first impressions? I need to know, because I was with you at the CIPD, and I can only imagine that this was the polar opposite of anything and everything that was going on at the CIPD conference. So yes, please, I've been dying to know since you got back. It was a very different crowd, but actually quite a similar kind of buzz of excitement. And particularly when we were standing in the queue outside, there was quite a long queue because it was quite heavy security, as you'd probably expect. But it did feel that same sort of buzz of kind of like, oh, who's here? It's going to be a good day. And what's everyone wearing? Because a lot of people were wearing the Reform turquoise. So the men had Reform ties, women had turquoisey dresses. I saw turquoise nail polish. I saw patriotic handkerchiefs in top pockets. Lots of people were wearing this football shirt, which I thought was rather strange initially, which said Reform on the front, and on the back it said Farage and the number 10, which I hadn't seen this before kind of out in the wild. So I thought, where did these T-shirts come from? Anyway, it turned out they're actually selling them inside the conference when you got in. But it did have that same sense of kind of a community, a disparate community of people who didn't know each other necessarily. I mean, there were lots of couples and friends and stuff, but it was people who had come together for a very specific reason that was partly to do with the content, but also to do with the community, bringing together a community of people to be among your people, basically. That's kind of how it felt. So it felt like the excitement that you get before a big gig or before a football match, when you're queuing to get in, it was very similar. And then once you got into the main conference hall, it was like one of those big kind of hangars. And they had in the center of it were food stalls with picnic tables, which people were sitting at,
People were already drinking at like 11 o'clock when I got there, which they were not at the CIPD festival, and they were not at the Stonewall conference either. But I gather that's quite normal at some of these political conferences. But I'm not particularly used to that. And then around the edges of this big hall were sort of smaller stages, which all had different names. So they were called the Nelson stage, the Britannia stage, the Endeavour stage, the Liberty stage, and the Union stage. You might get some themes from that. And they were smaller areas where there were microphones, but they didn't have those awful headsets that they had at the CIPD conference, which we didn't really like because it takes away some of the buzz. So there was quite a lot of buzz. It wasn't absolutely packed, but it was pretty busy. And then they had this merch stand, which had football shirts, football scarves, caps, wallets, and water bottles. They were all made in the UK this year, because I gather last year some of it was manufactured overseas, and they got themselves into trouble for that. There was a corporate area which was sponsored by Heathrow. I didn't see lots of other brands there, and there was quite a lot of turquoise carpeting. Obviously, that's their colour, which I thought compared to the CIPD festival, which was packed with stands of people trying to flog you stuff, this just didn't have a lot of people selling stuff. Now, I think there were probably some bonuses from that. I think it probably meant that the content was better as a result. We talked about how having too many sponsors, how basically chasing the dollar too much at your conference can quickly erode the quality of the content that you're presenting. But on the other hand, this felt a little bit like, is the Reform brand still a little bit toxic in terms of other brands wanting to be seen to be there? We can talk about that a little bit more. Did I miss anything from that?
So what sort of people were there? Did you see a span of ages? Did you see lots of women there? Was there any kind of other types of diversity, ethnic diversity or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was a significantly older crowd. I would say the average age was probably 55, maybe 60 even. So it was definitely an older crowd. There were quite a lot of younger men there, though, and I'll come back to that because I think it's quite significant. Not a lot of younger women, mainly white. And I would say women, probably 25% of people were women. So it was quite male in that way. And I think things like the merch stand having football shirts and a football scarf did bring that home a little bit. And I wasn't quite sure what the messaging was there. I don't know if I want like ladies merch for lady reformers, but it did feel a little bit have that slightly that you were sort of assumed to be a man unless there was an exception kind of thing. So that was a little bit noticeable, but not hugely. In terms of racial diversity, there were certainly people there that weren't white. I didn't see anybody in anything that I would call other than Western clothing, although there were people who spoke and asked questions at various sessions who said that they were Muslim. So I don't think they were completely unrepresented, but certainly I didn't see any hijabs, for example. It wasn't white. It wasn't like weirdly only white at all. If that's what people would imagine.
That's what a lot of people would be imagining, that this is just going to be, if the CIPD was the Festival of Work, then the Reform UK conference they're going to assume is the Festival of White People. But it really isn't as simple as that. And that's another thing that employers need to realise.
I'm quite interested in who employers and businesses were sending to the conference. So I seem to remember there was some polling by I think it was the Chartered Institute of Public Relations in advance of the conference that showed that there was a significant number of people from the PR and public affairs industry that were planning to attend on behalf of their organisations, much more than have attended reform conferences in the past and much more than attended other conferences like Lib Dems in the past, even though they've got more MPs. So I think businesses were obviously attending, but maybe not necessarily sending their top people to try and persuade or sell, but rather sending people to be ears on the ground and take the temperature of what's going on there. Was that the vibe of those stalls that you saw?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I assumed because there weren't stands there that those brands weren't there at all. But then when I came back and did a bit more reading around it, there was a really good Bloomberg podcast, wasn't there, on this, which was interesting. And then there was a couple of pieces in the Financial Times and something in the New Statesman, I think, about this, that that firms were there, but they were in quite a low-key capacity. Let's dig into the reasons for that later on, because I want to come back to that. It's a really good question. Shall I go through my main kind of takeaways, and then you guys can kind of chip in any thoughts as we go along? So the first takeaway I would say is that this is a movement with lots of energy, confidence, and momentum. So the Birmingham NEC is a really big venue. In addition to the hall, which I just mentioned, with all the smaller theatres and with all the smaller stages, there was also the main arena, which is where Nigel Farage came and gave his addresses, which is where they had lots of the big speakers on there. And that was a really, really big space. I never saw that completely full, but it was pretty full. And when it was full, there was a really, really good atmosphere. The compere was the Reform chairman, which is a chap called Dr. David Bull. If you're a viewer of Talk TV, you will know him from that. He, I have to say, was a complete natural. He was working the crowd. He was completely freestyling. He looked so natural up there. He was funny. He was entertaining. There was warmth. I have to say they did a really, really good job of that initial kind of welcome. I think what really came across was their confidence. They really understand what they're selling. They understand their audience, and they're not afraid of their audience as well. So there was a lot of kind of interaction with the audience, although on the stage they didn't ask questions and things like that. But there was a lot of kind of playing to the gallery, if you like, from whoever was on stage. There was a real interaction between them and the audience. And this is a big venue, so it's not easy to do that. And I thought, I haven't been to other party conferences, but I don't think that's normal for them to feel like. I mean, they were almost like the big comedians. They were that confident up there. Nigel Farage was incredibly confident, and again, didn't seem to be reading from a script. So on the first morning, Angela Rayner resigned that morning, and then there was the cabinet reshuffle. So that was all happening kind of live, kind of in the background. So when they came on, they were absolutely loving that. I saw some story about how that news had overshadowed their conference or something, and that wasn't my read of it at all. My read was they were delighted. They found it really funny. They found it really entertaining, and that's almost what lit the whole thing up. To be honest, was Angela Rayner's resignation. Obviously, they were pleased about that. There were jokes about the cabinet reshuffle, and they're kind of openly rude about the incumbents, and it's quite hard not to kind of get kind of sucked into that, because some of it was really funny. There was a joke about Keir Starmer couldn't stop talking about Farage all the time, and Dr. David Bull said he's got a man crush on Farage, which it was pretty cheeky, but it kind of works on lots of levels, that joke, and it was funny. And then he was talking about the new party created by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, which he called the Fruit and Nut Party. Richard Tice made a joke about the public sector needing Ozempic to slim down. It was quite difficult not to kind of find some of that stuff kind of amusing. So when the speakers came on, it felt a bit like, it really reminded me of the X Factor live finals. Do you remember? There was like this loud music, and there were pyrotechnics. Sometimes that was when Farage came on. Jets of dry ice when Nadine Dorries came on. It was like a Prince video. I mean, it was, there was just a lot going on. Andrea Jenkin, who's the mayor for Greater Lincolnshire, came on in this sparkly jumpsuit singing a pop song that she'd written apparently 20 years ago, which was called Insomniac. And her line was, "Is this god-awful Labour government giving you sleepless nights and insomnia too?" So it was a bit, I mean, it was bonkers, but it was quite fun. And I mean, it's nowhere near the level of razzmatazz that we've seen from the American political rallies. But for a UK political event, I think it was pretty exceptional. I was going to ask Levi, because you've been to political conferences before, haven't you? Does any of this chime for you or no?
It does. I mean, one of the comments that I've seen recently about this conference for reform was that there was definitely a positive energy, but it was markedly different to the energy that you get at other party conferences, where the positive energy is very tactical. If, for example, you go to the Conservative Party conference, a lot of people are feeling upbeat. They're talking about, if we do this, we can win seats in these areas. It's very kind of politically tactical. Whereas the reform vibe is more about positivity for the country. It's a vision for the country as a whole. Whether it's one that you sign up to or not, I think the analysis of it is that it's a different level of positivity, and that makes it a very different beast, I think. It doesn't have that nerdiness. That might just be because it's a very young party, and in a sense, they're not really focused on particular policies at this stage, but more an overall vibe of where they want things to go. But I also think it's to do with the times that we're in, that this is largely, although it's positive, it's also about a rejection of the other mainstream parties. So it's sort of pulled away from those parties rather than necessarily pulled towards a very specific vision, which is yet to crystallise, I think.
I think the mood was serious in places, because I think they are deeply concerned about the state of the country, particularly illegal immigration and the sense of losing what they would call sort of national identity. But I think, and they're worried about things like crime as well, and the economy. Lots of people have said that they're worried about their children and their grandchildren. So there certainly was real seriousness, and I think on quite a deep level. But I think they did quite well to balance that with a lot of hope. The hope for me seemed to come from the sort of common sense vibe from the people there. These are practical, self-motivated people who have frankly lost faith in experts and in the sort of managerial class, sometimes called the lanyard class. And they frankly think they can do better themselves. And there are aspects of what we're doing in this country that are not working very well. And so you could sort of see why that's the conclusion that they've reached, is that it's like, oh, well, you've all made such a mess of it. If this is the best that the experts can do, then move over and let's do this ourselves. It was quite noticeable to me also, given my kind of magazine background, I always notice what everyone's wearing, and the women were in very high heels, but they look very confident. I think there was a styling team. I think they were in great dresses. They were in like one colour suits, bold colours. Hair and makeup had been done. There weren't like boxy jackets with like black trousers and flat shoes. It wasn't quite as full on as a kind of Republican party, things. It wasn't giant hair, but it was significantly big hair. So I think they had made a real effort in terms of the look and feel. The men all looked smart as well. And then just a little bit more on that audience interaction. One thing they did in the main arena, which I thought worked brilliantly, was they had Jeremy Kyle, yes, of the Jeremy Kyle show. He's back. Who was kind of roaming around in the crowd among the people. It's like sitting on the steps, chatting to people with the microphone, and it was absolutely brilliant. Whatever you think about him and how his career in daytime TV ended, he's absolutely brilliant with people. And it was genuinely funny and exciting. You've got no idea. When you put a microphone in the face of a random member of the public, you have absolutely no idea what they're going to say. And that's what makes it fun, right? So he was roaming around the audience, talking to members of the audience. And you know what it had? It had that feel that this is a party who's not afraid of their supporters, who doesn't want to keep them at arm's length, who wants to embrace them. This is a group of people who might be sort of feeling excluded by the mainstream or by the media. And it was really all about bringing them in and basically kind of giving them a hug and saying, we get it, we understand you, you're welcome here. That's how that felt to me. And if I can compare that with the Stonewall conference, where you'll remember there were no questions at all from the audience ever at any point. And then the CIPD Festival of Work, where we were all, there was no roving mic at all, was there either? And it was, you had to put your question into the Slido app, and then they didn't answer it anyway.
They didn't even show it. The questions at the CIPD conference were being completely stage managed.
Yeah. So this had that feel of, ask us anything, we're ready. There wasn't a Q&A directly to the speakers in the big arena moments with Farage or whoever was the panel. They didn't have questions then, but they did have questions, loads of questions in for the smaller stages.
And that's very different to other party political conferences where the level of stage management is off the charts. I mean, one of the main conversations you generally get at a party conference is who wasn't allowed to put their question forward, who wasn't allowed to put a motion in, and so the vibe is one of, oh, we're not allowed to influence our own party. And so even though people are feeling upbeat on the face of it in some ways, I think there's a real sense of factionalism and, which side is in favour, which side is dominating the discourse. And I think that is something, I mean, I don't know how easily party political conferences can change, but I definitely think other conferences should be having the confidence to do the open mic and say, let's talk, and just feel that they don't need to come up with a perfect answer that's spot on. You just have to have broad confidence in your position. And that gets Reform a long way in terms of connecting with people, I think, that confidence.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second point, which I think is going to surprise you. It certainly surprised me. They hardly mentioned DEI. Diversity, equity, inclusion. It got mentioned once. I didn't go to everything, but I heard it mentioned once. They were talking about wasted funds in local councils, and they just said, get rid of all DEI stuff. And then they just moved on, and that was it. I mean, I listen to lots of political podcasts and YouTube channels, as I think you guys do too. And basically DEI is never, ever mentioned in a positive way. And it's become a sort of shorthand for everything that's wrong with workplaces and this kind of overdone sort of social engineering that's happening within organisations that people increasingly really, really don't like. And I'm sure I've heard Nigel Farage talking disparagingly about HR departments, that kind of thing. So I was expecting us to get an absolute kicking and to be the punchline of loads of jokes, but I honestly didn't hear it. I mean, there were lots of sessions that I wasn't at, but I looked at, but the ones that I went to were ones I was expecting us to come up, frankly, and we just didn't. They just were not talking about us. So, I mean, the big issues were immigration, specifically illegal immigration, crime, local communities. They said things like building from the ground up, not the top down. There was lots of talk about national pride, identity, history, respect for the armed forces and veterans. There was a bit about foreign policy. There was always a big cheer when anybody mentioned farming or fishing. But it was quite light on education, everything from schools to universities. It was pretty light on health. It was pretty light on business. The business session I went to was all about growth. And basically the panel's view was that our public sector is far too big and the private sector is constrained by too much regulation. And they want to scrap net zero. But it wasn't really about the sort of stuff that we discuss in terms of the managerial systems, and we just weren't. It just didn't come up. Are you surprised at that?
I am a little bit, because it has felt like this year that DEI is an easy whipping boy, and so I really thought that they would have gone to town, and the fact that they didn't is probably a good thing, because as a political party, they should be focusing on bigger things than just what DEI departments might be doing. That's a downstream fix, if they even think it's something that needs to be fixed. It's a downstream issue compared to the far bigger issues that any political party should be looking at.
I don't know if I'm that surprised by that, to be honest. I think that it's about this is a conference in its time, right? It's about scoring political points in the current moment. And I'm not sure there's as much distance between Reform and, on the other hand, the Tories and Labour on DEI as there is on something like immigration. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, Labour is already a bit on the back foot when it comes to DEI. They don't quite know where they stand. On the one hand, they're making very, common sense policies around, or starting to make common sense policies around sex and gender. But they're also, on the other hand, talking about we're still going to introduce a trans-inclusive conversion therapy ban. So they're confused, but they're not really clearly nailing their colours to a particular mast. And the Tories, if anything, are agreeing with reform on a lot of DEI-related things. So I don't know if the political points are there to be scored. But then you think about something like immigration. Immigration absolutely separates the Reform Party from the Tories because of the whole Boris wave of immigration. It's a way of saying we're not going to do to this country what the Tories have been doing all those years. And it absolutely separates Labour from Reform. So I think they're just picking the topics in the current moment that separate the parties most distinctly. And if you look at the manifesto that the Reform Party had in last year for the election, they had some quite clear policies on DEI. They're not policies I particularly like. Things like, it just says replace the 2010 Equalities Act. They couldn't even get the name of the act right that they're wanting to replace. They called it the Equalities Act. And then it just had these broad statements that didn't even ring true for me. Now, I'm all for reforming the Act in certain ways, but I think this kind of broad brush approach is where they're currently at. So maybe they feel like they've done that bit. They've got a broad line on DEI, which is broadly making all of their members happy, and it's broadly winning the arguments out there with people. Do they need to nail that point home now, or actually is there more to be gained by focusing on other issues like immigration, national identity, possibly the economy?
I think part of the reason, on reflection, why they didn't go bigger on the DEI stuff was because I think the demographic of the people that were at the event, given their age particularly, and probably the sorts of jobs that they're doing, these are practical people that get stuff done. These are not really managerial class types, and if they were, they're probably retired now. So I think they might be like, what's DEI? They've just, and so it's the younger people who've seen this come in. It's probably the younger men who were there, I think, who I'll come back to, who feel like they're being discriminated against, particularly if they're white. That it just wasn't really that. The conference crowd wasn't the right crowd. And I wonder if they talk about DEI when they know they've got a slightly younger, more middle class audience, and then they flex it. They flex what they're talking about depending on whether they've got their broad base there or not. And they just know, and DEI is not something that comes up in those focus groups with the broad party base. I think that's the impression I get. It's not what people are worrying about. They're worrying about their children and their grandchildren and crime and immigration. And that's so talking about DEI might almost be a bit kind of luxury beliefs for them. It's like, why are you talking about this workplace thing that I've never come into contact with? Interesting that you mentioned about the Equality Act. So my third takeaway is that they are talking about scrapping the Equality Act. I didn't hear it hammered home as a policy point, although that's interesting that you've seen it written down. I didn't hear it hammered home by anybody from the party, but I went to a session on one of the smaller stages about their planned legislative changes, and I asked a question about what would happen to the Equality Act, and I was a bit taken back actually by the thought of like scrapping it. They just said, "Oh, scrap it." And which the panel seemed to have agreed was the solution. They really talked about what they called a factory reset back to 1997. This is a range of lawyers, and they were like, actually, there've been so many unintended consequences from the Equality Act. They did get the name right, and other legislation that's been brought in, that they almost felt like getting rid of all of it was probably the default, and then we'll just hang on to anything that happens to by chance have been good that the Tories or Labour have done that we want to hang on to. And that was kind of it. The lawyer who was there, he's a chap called Luke Gittos, whose name I recognised. He said that the Equality Act was a legal solution to a societal problem, by which he meant discrimination. And he said that never works. So they just sort of, I don't know. Listen, I'm not going to, lots of employers don't love the Equality Act, but I still felt like the possibility of scrapping it felt quite significant to me. I mean, if you think about how much of HR practice kind of almost revolves around the Equality Act now, I feel like, like this idea of discrimination, I think has become quite central to HR's role, avoiding discrimination, avoiding or being able to defend yourself if somebody accuses you of discrimination, according to the Equality Act, has become, I think, sort of second nature now to HR teams, and that's sort of originally some of what DEI was supposed to be doing, wasn't it? Creating an environment where you'd be less vulnerable if somebody said that you had discriminated. But I suddenly thought the idea of scrapping it, what would that mean for HR? I don't think it's something they need to worry about right now because they're not in power. There isn't an election planned until 2029. But I just sort of thought, ooh, that's a big, if we're anywhere close to that happening, and even discussing it feels like a big idea for HR. I think it's also because it doesn't, thinking about how it fits with their general ethos, their disdain for the Equality Act seems to fit with their allergy to victim culture and grievance culture. And they seem to think that it's encouraging people to not be autonomous and to not take responsibility for their own behavior. I guess looking for someone to blame all the time rather than looking to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and crack on and get things done. I don't know. I think that I can see why they're allergic to it, almost sort of philosophically or ideologically or kind of emotionally, really.
Well, they're not the only ones, though. We went to an event earlier this year, didn't we, Tanya? Organised by a group called Don't Divide Us, where they have done their own analysis of how the Equality Act has been used for race-based discrimination tribunals. And they found that it's not being applied in the way that it was intended, that organisations are using the Equality Act and flexing the muscles of it to only flexing the muscles of it in a biased way to only support certain groups within a protected characteristic, but not other groups within the same protected characteristic. And that has kind of exacerbated in some workplaces that victim culture. And that is something that I've seen. I've seen it within my clients or within some of my clients where these HR departments have actually created issues that they're then bemoaning having to deal with. So it's not just Reform UK that is taking a look at the Equality Act sideways, thinking, what have we done here? What have we allowed to happen to our organizational cultures because it's not being used the way in which it was intended?
It will be interesting to see what happens to that policy area between now and the election, whenever the election happens, and whether they stick with this broad brush, we would repeal approach, or whether through that time that elapses between now and then, they formulate a more fine brush approach of we would remove certain provisions within the Act, we would change the emphasis, say in an area like harassment, we would strengthen the reasonableness test so that it's much more, it's necessary to objectively justify why someone sees something as harassment rather than placing so much emphasis on the perceptions of the recipient. Now, if they've got it in them as a party, I don't know if they have, to start really taking a fine look at the detail, it will be interesting to see how that plays, because in a way that might be the kind of stuff that just doesn't play well with their target audience. In a way, you're by focusing on that level of detail, you're giving the whole thing too much credibility. And I think what's really helping them become so popular at the moment is the broad brush approach. But I don't know if that will be sustainable for years before an election. Something's going to change. I think it'll be interesting to see what.
Yeah, it was also, as an aside, I don't know if this is an irony or not quite, but it's worth remembering that while we do have the Equality Act in place, it looks like reform supporters are able to use it to protect themselves at work. So there's an ongoing case of a chap called Saber Poursaidi, who's taking legal action against his employer, which is a housing association called Hightown, with the help of the Free Speech Union. He says they sacked him for being a reform supporter. But we know that political belief is not a protected characteristic. But I think what he and the Free Speech Union have done is to pull out strands that are most likely to count as a philosophical belief. So, for example, his views on immigration and net zero. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that case. And it seems like they're quite happy to use, fair enough, good for him, I guess. They're happy to use the Equality Act when it protects them. So I guess it's useful for as long as it's useful, maybe. Interesting that his father's Iranian, so he knows a thing or two about free speech.
And the same happens with free speech, right? I mean, people were often interested in protecting the free speech of the people they agree with. So they'll talk about free speech when it feels like the downtrodden are on their side. But actually, when you talk about introducing new legislation, repealing whole legislation, it it impacts across the board. And I don't know if they're really grappling with that at the moment, or maybe they're just not interested right now. I mean, immigration, things like that feel like territory where if they come up with very clear policies now, or they start to formulate those policies, they'll go a long way. This stuff feels like slightly fringe, doesn't it, to their core purpose.
I think, Levi, that just like with any group of people, they're going to be rife with their own inconsistencies, because we've seen it on the left where if you've got the same opinions, same accepted opinions, then you can scream them out till the cows come home. But if you disagree, then suddenly the left, which used to be the bastion of free speech decades ago, is now the political side that comes down hard and said, you shouldn't be allowed to say this because it might hurt somebody's feelings. Now, the way that I see it is I would rather live here and get my feelings hurt than live somewhere where free speech isn't a right that we get to enjoy.
Okay, one of the other takeaways, I don't want to spend too long on this because I'm not a business journalist, but I just thought it's worth making the point that they push the message that they're strongly pro-growth. And as part of that, they would say that they're strongly pro-employers, particularly the private sector, particularly smaller businesses. So for them, their vision of a healthy economy would be a much, much smaller public sector, which they frequently call bloated, and a booming private sector. So they're against regulation, they're against red tape. They talked about crypto. You'd be interested here, Heeral. They talked about crypto a lot, deregulating that. They said it was a mistake to increase national insurance. So they basically wanted to make it easier for private businesses to make more money. And I guess as part of that would probably involve making it easier to get rid of people. So I didn't hear anybody mention the employment rights bill specifically, but I was wondering about what that would mean for the future of that in their heads. And I wondered whether is it possible to be pro-employers and also pro-employees? And I wondered whether that sort of, whether talk about business was kept to the smaller stage, because a lot of people who were at that event would be on the employee side of it as well. These are workers, these are working people, and so they need the protection. So it's like, hang on a minute, how are we going to be pro-employers and pro-employees? Because sometimes those two things don't go together. I mean, they should do if we're all good employers and good employees, but those things don't always go together, as we know. So that was one message that I didn't quite understand. The final point I wanted to make is that this movement clearly really, really appeals to lots of young men. And I was thinking about that in relation to what employers should get from that. Not only that they're going to have people working in their organization who are likely to be sympathetic to reform and be interested in Farage and those sorts of messages. And these are the same guys, I think, who probably like Elon Musk and Trump in the States. It's the same crowd. And I think it's time so you need to think about those people if they're working in your organization already. But I think it's also time for employers to revisit their approach to employer branding when you think about early careers. So for their campus outreach, for example, I've seen for at least the last 5 years, it's been strongly pushing this whole bring your whole self to work stuff, what people would call woke. I don't tend to use that word very much, but it's what they would call that. And they're assuming that all of those messages are a big hit with all young people. But the stats seem to be showing that an awful lot of younger people, they've kind of had enough of the safetyism stuff, particularly young men. And I was wondering about the employer branding agencies, and there are some very big ones that make a lot of money, but they are also probably staffed by left-leaning graduates based in London, and their idea of what young people want is probably influenced by their own personal politics. So I think they need to look at that again, and I think it also might be a mistake to kind of weld your brand to sustainability and to use that as a way to attract young people, because these guys really don't like net zero. And so, they are going to bring back all of those conflicting views about climate change, which is not an expert subject for me at all. So I'm not going to get into that. But, so again, the messaging that employers have found they've thought is really appealing to young people aren't going to work in the sort of, as the mood shifts around some of these issues.
Well, if we just go back to the bring your whole self to work phrase that HR teams have been throwing around for years, I think many of these organizations are fully or wholly ill-equipped to actually handle these men bringing their whole selves to work. So they need to do a very quick about turn to understand, okay, what really do we expect of our people? Fundamentally, we expect them to be professional. Well, what does that look like in the workplace? To what degree are we going to enable people to literally bring their whole selves to work? Because they don't really mean that. They never have meant that.
I think we've got some really stormy seas ahead, to be honest. I think we got a taste of what we're going to see with Brexit, where workplaces were in a really messy situation. So, there was almost this kind of imposed set of assumptions about how people were meant to be voting, and people were surprised when they heard that their colleagues were voting for Brexit. Obviously, a lot of people were surprised by the actual result of the vote. But at the same time, all of that was really focused on quite intellectual issues. In some way, Brexit was quite an intellectual endeavour. We want to liberate ourselves in terms of our lawmaking abilities. We want to bring back sovereignty. I think when you start talking about issues like immigration, identity politics, you're not just talking about, kind of theory and intellectual ideas. You're talking very much about people and their own families and their relationships. And I think that we're going to see in workplaces brought into this debate more and more and more. I'm not sure how equipped they are, partly because of the whole bring your whole self to work thing. There's almost this kind of, they've invited a whole blurring of the boundaries between home and work life. And it's going to be hard for people to now start drawing those boundaries and say, actually, we didn't mean bring in your views about immigration when we said bring your whole self to work. But it's like, well, why? Why not? So it's bring your whole self to work only seems to mean certain things come into the workplace and other things are meant to implicitly stay at home. So I definitely see that playing out in the sector that I work in the university sector. I can already see some tension starting to grow between people with different sets of opinions. We think of higher education as being a kind of monolithic kind of hive mind. Everyone thinks the same. Everyone's liberal, graduates, da, da, da. But actually, these are big organisations with lots of pockets of different cultures. And I think things are becoming increasingly tense right now.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys actually, because you're doing that kind of client work as well at the moment, that sort of training work. Which organisations or industries do you think are the most exposed right now to these sorts of issues, in terms of having aligned themselves with one particular view, or just having created an environment where people aren't allowed to talk about any of this stuff properly? I mean, you just mentioned the university sector, Levi. Is that because there are more? I mean, I guess I'm thinking about all the academics who work there who seem to be quite similar mindset and the students. But you're suggesting, is it the people on campus, like the security teams and what other sorts of team, catering staff and those sorts of people who have different views? What do you mean exactly?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is generalising, but I think that I've certainly received more inquiries lately of a certain kind, which start along the lines of, we're having some problems with Team X, and that team tends to have quite outdated views, or they tend to be a bit behind the times when it comes to language. So they're very much seeing the problem through their kind of current lens of, the mainstream culture in the organisation is right, and these people just need to get in step. But actually, I think what will happen as reform, support starts to grow further, as I suspect it might, I think that people will be even more empowered to express their opinions at work. And some of what gets expressed will be legitimate opinions. It will be just it will just be, a different opinion that the organisation isn't used to having aired. And some of what gets aired might be inappropriate. Some of it might cross the line. So when I get called into work with a particular team, often what I find is that there's a mixture of things going on. Some of the things require a clear line to be drawn. That kind of language is genuinely unacceptable. It's going, you really are making your colleagues feel uncomfortable when you say that. Whereas other things, it's like, well, actually, expressing your opinion that there are two sexes should not be, that's an organizational misunderstanding of where the line should be drawn. And so it's a really complex situation, because people in HR departments, for example, I don't think they will feel confident having those conversations, drawing those distinctions and saying these things are appropriate in terms of bringing to work. But when you do so, you need to be ready for other people to counter those opinions. And then these things cross a line and shouldn't come into work, because I think at the moment it's so blurred. We see John Lewis, having photo sessions of their staff in bondage gear or whatever it is, and you think, well, there's no boundary around what is work sphere, what's you bringing your personality to bear at work, which I think is something we have to do. We're not robots, right? And what is inappropriate for the workplace, what should be nowhere near the workplace. These are distinctions that we've lost, I think, in our narratives.
And so going back to, I guess, what you were asking, Tanya, there are some sectors, there are some pockets within huge sectors that are going to struggle with this far more than others. There seems to have developed a type or a strand of HR that is completely incompatible with actual relationships between people, actually being commercially minded as well, because that HR team itself is at risk of creating tribunals within itself. I personally think that's far less likely to happen in large private sector HR teams than the sheer volume of nonsense we're seeing coming out of public sector, third sector HR teams.
I'm wondering about the staff networks as well are going to become even more. I mean, they're already a problem, and I think they're going to become even more of a problem, because if you're going to deliver people the perfect place to grumble about, their politics in the workplace, I just don't see how that's going to go well. And I think I get the feeling, I don't know what you guys think, but I get the feeling a lot of employers, particularly private sector, are saying, hang on a minute, these staff networks look like a good idea for about 5 minutes in 2020. And it quite quickly became clear that they were creating a lot more problems than they were solving. Were we trying to show that we were inclusive? Where were we going with that? Were we trying to protect ourselves against discrimination claims? By saying, well, we've got this LGBT staff group, we've got this black staff group. If they were, those seem to be like very small gains compared to the very large risks of having a staff group which is frankly unsupervised and coming out with some pretty wild stuff, which is not aligned to the company at all. And if you've spent all this time encouraging people to bring their politics, frankly, to the workplace, I don't know how much sympathy I have, if I'm honest, with some of these employers now, because I think they've allowed themselves to get into this situation, which now they need to reset. But I think maybe they just didn't realize, they thought for too long that this was kind of being kind and being inclusive. And because by the time they realized there were problems with any of this stuff, they'd also created an environment where you're not allowed to question any of this stuff. I think they then found themselves more and more backed into an ever tighter corner, and that's where they are now. I've been thinking for some time, though, about organizations which either have departments where you're going to get very different types of people. So for example, within like publishing, there'll be some people who have to deal with the production guys and the logistics guys, who will be a totally different crowd. And then within big banks and things, there's the sales guys and the EAs, and they're a different crowd again. So you've already got them sitting side by side, or at least working together. So I'm almost surprised it hasn't come up before. I think it's going to come up more and more, because I think the people that have been kept quiet are now going to feel more and more emboldened to say, oh, how was your weekend? Oh, actually, I went to the Reform Party conference. And it's going to be like, oh, okay, is that a microaggression? I mean, what are we doing here? So I think that's going to come up more and more.
I've noticed a trend when it comes to staff groups. I've got clients where they're realizing, okay, we need to put in place very, very clear terms of reference for the staff groups that we already have in existence. And that's what we are going to see more of, because they know that they can't necessarily just shut them down, but they are putting some really clear boundaries around them.
Well, of course, they could just shut them down. They just get some blowback. They could just hold the line and say, guys, we're not doing that anymore. I think what they'll do also is they'll remove budget and they'll scale them down and make them less and less kind of powerful. That's what I would do anyway if I was them. I was thinking also about retail is quite a good example of an industry where where you've got decision makers in kind of head office, and then you've got a very large workforce nationwide, who are probably not that graduate class, who are much more likely to be into these sorts of movements. And frankly, they're not prepared to be quiet anymore, because why should they? These, if these are legitimate views as they always were, then why shouldn't they be allowed to say that at work? We're going to get into this problem with these. I was thinking about flags. People had flags at this event as well. The St. George's flag and the Union Jack flag. And I was thinking, we've talked a lot about the Progress flag, and I thought these flags are going to be the death of everybody, because people are going to start sticking these flags on their laptops, just as they've been sticking their Progress flag on their laptop. And then is that, what's that saying? When you open your laptop and there's a thing that says Reform UK on it, what message are you sending to the person that you're sitting next to in the meeting? The flag thing, I don't know where I sit on the flags thing, but the flags are going to be a problem. I think that would be my top tip. I was thinking also about journalism. I mean, having been to this conference and then having seen the press coverage about the conference, there's a sort of sneering tone that I see from reporters who are supposed to be politically neutral. But I feel like a lot of journalists, they let their politics creep into their coverage, and they're pushing that onto their audiences. So I would say journalism's probably got a problem here. And I did hear, I watched the BAFTA Awards last year, and I remember seeing they were all obviously very into the sort of lovey politics. There was mention of the trans stuff, and they're all very anti-Trump and they're all anti-Musk. And then, so that was the kind of general joke. David Tennant was hosting that year, and they were all very pleased with themselves, and they all assumed that everybody in this very, very large theatre all had exactly the same views, which seemed to me to be a misjudgment. But anyway, and then they patted themselves on the back for this brilliant scheme or something they were doing, which was some kind of social mobility scheme. And they trotted out all these young kids, presumably from quite disadvantaged backgrounds, and they trotted them out like mascots. And but it was more like patting themselves on the back. Aren't we great for giving some paid jobs to some kids who want to get into the film industry or TV industry? And I was thinking, I bet these guys have been sitting there listening to this self-indulgent nonsense for the last hour and a half, thinking, I'm not sure I want to work in this industry anymore because these people are so awful. And it's like, those views are not compatible with people from certain cultural backgrounds. The trans thing is really, really contested. And they just don't seem to be getting that at all. And there is this class issue as well, which is a lot of people think, it's not a good idea to divide people into all these little groups according to race and this whole white privilege thing, all of that kind of stuff. A lot of people are allergic to it. But the middle class people who've been in charge for too long, conscious of my accent here, have been just running the show without any thought to anybody else, why anybody might be keeping quiet in the room. I think the chickens are going to come home to roost, I think. And I think, to a certain extent, I think they kind of deserve it.
This mess was all pretty inevitable. The more I think about it, the more I think we've never really grappled with a lot of these issues. It's really tempting, and I don't know if this was the vibe at the Reform Conference, but it's really tempting to kind of think of the past as some, halcyon perfect, context that we want to return to. And in some ways, I look back at, when I was working in the 90s, and I think, well, there was a clear sense of you bring your work self to work. There was a sense of professionalism. There was a sense of boundaries in some ways, in some contexts. But actually, there were also a hell of a lot of problems. There was a lot of, depending on who you were and how you were just, So I remember one place I worked for a crane manufacturing company where the men's toilets had porn magazines in them, for example. I don't know, provided by the company or just allowed to be there, or I've no idea. And there was this, you would go to the toilet, I would go to the toilet and you'd have comments. If you were in there slightly too long, you'd have comments. I went to school, at a school where the teacher felt quite comfortable standing at the front of the class referring to gay people as perverts. So you think, well, if this is a golden age, I don't want to return to that, right? Like that's completely. So it felt on the surface like it had lots of boundaries, but it really didn't, really. So we've never grappled with it. We're grappling with this stuff for the first time, trying to find a context where, people could genuinely feel comfortable, but not impose themselves and their views and their attitudes and their beliefs on other people. That feels to me to be the line. It's that expectation that suddenly shifts everything. Then you're not just bringing yourself to work, you're bringing an expectation that other people will affirm who you are. That's very different. And I think that organisations should have thought this stuff through 2 or 3 years ago when issues like sex and gender started to rear their head. That was the opportunity to say, look, let's get ahead of this. Let's respond to the issues that we're obviously seeing playing out. But they played a numbers game. They said, you know what? These things are so rare, partly because people were too afraid to say anything a lot of the time, that we can just ride this out and the whole thing will fizzle out. And of course, it's not fizzled out. And I think what we will see in the next few years is that this stuff will grow and grow and grow as people become more assertive about saying, not only these are my views, but I have the right to express them. This is my freedom of speech. These are my rights that are backed up by a whole political party that now exists. It will be this sense of confidence about bringing this stuff into work. And because they didn't grapple with it and draw the boundaries and draw the lines, they're going to be dealing with this kind of mess now on a different level of mess.
I read something interesting where a UK person said that everything that we're facing in this country now, whether it's DEI related or otherwise, is the fact that we can't talk to each other. This goes back decades. We are a country that literally said to itself, just avoid the topics of politics and religion. Don't talk about it at dinner parties. Basically, just never bring it up. And those are exactly the areas that actually we are struggling with the most now, talking about politics with each other, talking about religion with each other. We are just completely incapable of having conversations with people that have different belief systems to us, different political beliefs to us, different value systems. And that's why we're seeing so many of these clashes now. And with that complete inability, this is why we see people saying, well, let's just they're doubling down on let's not have the conversation. So we shouldn't even be allowed to have the conversation.
Yeah, so a lot of the things we've been talking about there really are kind of the ideological aspects of a lot of these issues. And having recently been to different conferences, Tanya, did you see any similarities or differences between the Reform Conference and the other conferences you went to recently, Stonewall, Festival of Work and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite funny. It did suddenly strike me that there was this sort of almost religious kind of aspect to some of it. I thought at the beginning, David Bull, the chairman and compere, reminded me a little bit of one of those televangelists who used to heal people on TV in the sort of 90s and noughties in America. It was that kind of stuff. It was, on stage with a live mic, and it had that kind of feel to it. Although he was like a bit more like someone from the shopping channel, that kind of, it was all a little bit kind of like that. But there was something slightly culty. There were moments that were a little bit culty. There was a moment when Andrea Jenkins, who's the mayor for Lincolnshire, wanted us to repeat back. She said, Nigel Farage will be the next prime minister. And we were all supposed to repeat it back. And I was like, this feels churchy to me, which is something that we said, didn't we, Levi, when we talked about the Stonewall conference? It had that churchy vibe. I'm not doing a callback to, wait a second, I haven't thought this through. I don't know if I want to say that. What are we doing here? And everyone's just sort of saying it around you. That moment gave me pause. But I think it was that kind of sense of a congregation coming together, and the same actually, Heeral, with the Festival of Work that we went to, the CIPD HR event. Again, it was a very big gathering of lots of people who were there because they wanted to get something kind of emotional from it, and it was. Wouldn't go quite so far as to say that it was spiritual, although I was going to say that. But actually, someone sent me recently a clip of Lutfa Ali, who's the head of policy at the CIPD. And there's a clip in a session that you and I didn't see, Heeral, where he says that HR has a sacred duty when it comes to DEI.
The bottom line in all of this is we have a holy duty, we have a sacred duty on all of us that are in HR, because HR is the guardians of the EDI policy, always has been and will be.
And I was like, sacred is a hell of a big word. Yeah. So there is something churchy going on here. There is something about, is this what happens when you remove religion from society? You end up with people finding any sense of community wherever they can that's going to give them something deeper that they don't even really realize they're missing or looking for.
We seem to be fighting identity with identity. There's a genuine concern, an understandable concern about identity politics and multiculturalism and all these things which feel like they've been failed experiments on a massive scale. And the response to that, the solution that's been latched on is more identity, but of a very different kind, of a national kind. And I know we're meant to look at those flags and think either I don't like it because it's racist or I love it because it's patriotic. I don't think I have either of those reactions. I just think it's a sign that something's deeply wrong right now. Some people are really not feeling heard. There's a political anger and a frustration, and it's not about jumping to these extreme interpretations of racism versus patriotism. It's about saying, okay, well, what's not working? And I don't know if we've got any parties or politicians that are really grappling with that. They seem to be defaulting to these very broad brush approaches, which to me just inflame. But maybe we need to go through this process and see where it all settles in a few years' time. I don't know, but it's definitely a worry.
I think it comes back to a lack of curiosity. And this is not something that is just the feature of, senior leaders and HR teams that look around and go, oh, Reform UK voters, oh my goodness, what's happening to the country? They're not asking any questions as to why people might be supporting Reform UK. But that lack of curiosity exists everywhere. Can we actually have a conversation to ask ourselves what has happened in this country where now to put a flag up means you're racist or patriotic and nothing in between. It's just, I think it's a very strange set of affairs that no one is willing to have an honest conversation about.
So I guess my final question is, do we think employers need to change their approach to reform, or do they only need to worry if they get into power? It sounds like we think they need to worry now because this is already happening to their workplaces. Is that where we are?
That's where I've been at since the beginning of the year, if not earlier than that, if not before that. Reform UK supporters, so to the people watching, Reform UK supporters work in your organisations. It's as simple as that. So when your senior leaders, when your HR teams are putting up posts on LinkedIn about how they think Reform UK voters are stupid and they're sexist and they're racist and whatever else that they have said, and I've seen it, you need to very quickly start thinking twice about what you're putting out there, because if nothing else, your job is to be impartial and treat your employees fairly and not to make sweeping assumptions about this group of people, just like you wouldn't be so comfortable to make sweeping assumptions about any other group of people. So employers need to wise up very, very quickly. It's got nothing to do with whether Reform UK actually win an election or not.
I think there might be commercial implications to this as well in the next few years. I mean, we were talking about which brands were there or not there at the conference, and maybe should have been there. There are a couple of housing developers who were there, and I think that was a pretty shrewd move, to be honest, because Reform were talking about building houses. And then there was Heathrow were there. Presumably that was for similar sorts of reasons. And I spoke to a couple of people who said you would expect all the infrastructure type organisations to be there. The rail guys should have been there because they should be kind of schmoozing, frankly, for the government contracts if Reform do get in 2029. And it's never too soon to start the schmooze, right? And Reform does seem to me like the kind of organisation who will notice if you weren't there in 2025 and you weren't there in 2026. And, oh, you popped up in 2027, did you? Because you thought we might get in and you suddenly switched your brains on. So I thought there might be actual commercial implications. If organisations continue to dismiss Reform, they're going to miss out on some quite serious commercial contracts here, which seems like a big mistake to me. I think some of the reason why brands would be nervous are because they would be nervous about what their consumers would think if they're seen at this sort of event. If you're Vodafone, for example, do you want to be there? I mean, even if there's potentially big money in it, if there's some kind of contract to do with tech, Vodafone's customers, Vodafone's brand is quite youth-led. But I wondered also whether there's an element of whether it's something to do with their company culture and there's HR issues that are stopping them from turning up. Frankly, if you're going to say to your organisation, oh, we're going to the reform conference, we need some people to man the stand for 2 days, so we've picked these people, you're going to go. Like, are you going to have a staffing problem? I think you probably are. There are a lot of young people, particularly, who are allergic to the idea of Reform UK and would imagine that all their supporters would be horrible bigots and they wouldn't want to go and work on that stand. And I think they would have a problem. I think they would have a problem finding staff to go to that. And I think it would create a problem for them to say, we're going, it's happening, suck it up, guys, talk to these people, they're probably absolutely fine, go and talk to these people for 2 days. I think they'd have a problem. And I think that's a quite a damning indictment of where employers are. If you're afraid of your own staff and you're not sure you can find enough people to scrape together to send to the conference of the party which is doing best in the polls, I think you might have a problem.
This goes back to the safetyism issue that we were talking about before, right? They've let this culture develop in their organizations that says, we won't make you do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. Nothing will happen here that will upset you. And so then if being asked to go to the reform conference and man a stand is literally the definition of uncomfortable and I feel unsafe, then you've created that for yourselves, because that means there is no robustness to your culture. Individual people may not be robust, but is your culture robust? And I think most organizations are finding out that their cultures aren't robust at all.
Yeah, some of this is organisations needing to connect with reform potentially and feeling awkward about doing so. But the internal piece around what this all means for their employee relations, for the way their staff and their people get on with each other or not, I think that is going to become more and more of a problem very quickly. And I think that the preparation that should be going in now, it's already a bit too late, but it's better late than never, is to say, right, let's look at our value statements. Let's ensure that we're focusing on our core business. This is now no longer the time to be straying into areas that are politically contentious. We want them to focus on their work selves and their objectives and so on, bringing a bit of their personality into play. But the core reason they're at work is to do work. And that should be mirrored in your value statements, your objectives, your strategy. And so often we've seen examples where it's almost been everything but the core functions that are dealt with in these value statements and objectives. So I think that's the thing that could be a useful area for them to focus on. But I sense that they won't do it. I sense that they are going to sleepwalk into this problem, still thinking that they can get away with saying, no, on our side of the argument, it's fine because we really are an organisation that believes in these things. And then they will find they've got this internal dynamic problem emerging, which gets to the point very quickly where there are too many of these cases to manage easily. They're already not managing them. People can be put through complaints procedures for years in some cases.
So are we saying that we should leave politics out of the workplace completely, or are we saying that organisations need to get better at helping people to talk about politics and issues that touch on politics in the workplace, or are we not decided on that?
I'm undecided on that because I think it's very difficult to say to any employee, you can't talk about your politics in the workplace. And at the same time, is it an employer's job to teach their staff how to have discussions in a professional and polite way? Like, that is literally a waste of time. And if we're taking it back to source, well, what's failed here? Well, the education system's failed here, where people can't even have discussions with each other about things that they disagree on. Is it an employer's job to teach us to now do that? No, of course not. That's a waste of time. So they just need to draw some boundaries around, don't care what you're talking about, you just better do it in a professional way. And if you don't do it in a professional way, then we'll deal with it. But we're not going to sit here and run workshops for you on how to have discussions about topics that you might disagree on with each other. You're here to do a job, so get on and do it.
I think employers have to manage that tension, though, because employees have rights. Employees have rights under the religion or belief provisions of the Equality Act. They have free speech rights. And so simply saying keep this stuff out of work, that's how we're drawing the line.
I didn't say keep it out of work, though. I said have the discussions and make sure you do it professionally, but we're not going to sit here and teach you how to have these discussions.
But okay, so I think the problem there then is if people don't have that skill set, telling them to have that skill set won't help. Because
But taking on the responsibility of educating them on how to do that is not what they should be spending their time on.
I think that's true. I think there's a lot to be said for focusing everything on the work, in the language they use, the way they recruit, the way they talk about themselves as an organisation, the way they train. So the primary thing for me is focus on the work, focus on your core business. And then I think there's something to be said for saying, look, it's not as simple as saying there's work and personal. I think there are aspects of the personal that you will absolutely bring into work. But when you choose to do that, you must do so knowing that other people might disagree, they might challenge, they might feel offended. This is the basis on which we bring aspects of ourselves into work. We are doing so, or we should be doing so, knowing that there might be some challenge. And then there are other aspects of the self that don't belong anywhere near work. I think that religious proselytizing, for example, aggressive political campaigning, unlawful harassment, these things shouldn't be coming into. I don't think people should have the right. I know none of us is arguing for this. I don't think anyone should have the right to say, well, actually, that's my personal view that everyone should be Christian and therefore I'm bringing my whole self to work. So it's separating out those two types of the personal, the stuff that should remain private and at home from the stuff that people should bring, but do it knowingly and cautiously. And that takes a bit of time to unpick, I think, but that's what employers need to do. And I know it shouldn't be their job to do it, but I think in reality, it probably is.
I'm enjoying the robustness of this discussion. This is very reform, you guys. They love this stuff. It's all about meritocracy. It's about robust discussion. Like, we're on the right lines with this, as far as they're concerned. I don't know. That's what I think was the number one thing for me, is the robustness of this group of people. This movement is coming into workplaces that I think have become very soft and very unused to challenge. I think the sorts of conversations that we've had today are the conversations that employers are going to have. I'm going to set up a business network for employers so they can talk about these issues really robustly as well, because I think they again have suffered from the infrastructure around them, which includes the CIPD, which includes the HR industry press, has completely failed. I think it's fallen apart from under their feet, and they don't have the support they need to be able to have these sorts of conversations. So I'm really interested in creating that for them, and we will continue to have more of these robust discussions about meritocracy and DEI and people and culture and leadership for many, many, many months and years to come, I'm sure. Thank you both so much for joining. Really, really appreciate it. I hope you've learned something from. I should just hold up the thing, shouldn't I? This was the. See, I did actually. Look at how dog-eared it is. I really gave it a good go, guys. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Tanya. It was great to be here.